Good afternoon and welcome to Australian Indigenous Voices in Literature. Today's event is presented by the Waverley Council, located in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and Waverley Council's National Literary Award, the NIP. Just noting before we start off that today's event is being recorded and we will have questions at the end. My name is Evelyn Araluen. I am a poet, writer, researcher and editor. I grew up in Darug country, but I'm currently living on the lands of the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nations down here. I would like to give our apologies for Auntie Lola Ryan, who we were hoping to have today give a welcome to country, but it is NAIDOC week and things are incredibly busy. So we'd just like to give our thanks and respects to Auntie Lola, and I will begin this talk by myself acknowledging not only the land that I am on today, but the lands that our incredible speakers, who I'll introduce in a moment, are speaking from today. So as I've mentioned, I'm speaking to you from the Kulin Nations. This is land that was never ceded, that never ceded its sovereignty. It's land that has been protected since time immemorial by its custodians, by its caretakers, by its ancestors, its creator spirits, and by its living descendants who are now still continuing to protect their country. When we meet on Aboriginal lands, as this entire continent is, it's really important that we remember that acknowledging country is not simply a performance, it's not simply a gesture, it is a constant reminder that we must give honour, we must give thanks, we must give respect and our own reciprocity back to the land that protects us. I am a guest on this land. I come ancestrally from the Bundjalung Nation, but grew up and was sheltered by the Darug country, just as I am now sheltered by Kulin Nations. As a guest, it is important for me to always recall, remind and remember that I owe responsibility to this land, I owe care and I owe respect to it. And I would like to also give my thanks and my honour to the land from which our custodians are speaking, the Untitled Nation and then also the Kulin Nation. Actually, we have just heard that Auntie Lola is here and she can do a much better job of this, so I am going to pass over to Auntie Lola to give us a welcome to country. Okay, I've got Auntie Lola.
Hi, you there?
Hi, we can hear you.
Oh, good morning, everyone. Can you see me or just hear me?
Not yet, Aunt.
Oh, well, I'll just.
We've got you. Beautiful. Hello.
Thank you. We're all on now. So I'm a Darug woman from the Labrador Aboriginal community of Botany Bay. And I'd like to welcome you all here today to the Indigenous Voices in Literature's 2020 NAIDOC celebrations. Our theme this year always was, always will be, recognises that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have occupied and cared for this continent for many thousands of generations. Some say for 65,000 years. Caring for our land and waters was done in a sustainable way to ensure an ongoing source of food and water for survival. We are connected to our country in special ways, both spiritually and culturally. As Aboriginal people from all over Australia lived off the land and the waters only. There was no processed food in them days. I would like to acknowledge the Bidjigal and Gadigal clans, who were the traditional custodians of the land we are gathered on, and on their behalf welcome you all. NAIDOC Week is a time for our people to share our culture with all Australians and each other, as it is one of the oldest living cultures in the world. So on behalf of the La Perouse Local Aboriginal Land Council, my ancestors and elders, I welcome you all, and I'd like to say happy NAIDOC Week, even though we're right at the end of it, and always will, always was, always will be. Thank you. Sorry we were late.
Thank you so much. Thank you
Thank you,
so
Evelyn.
much.
We'll chat soon.
We will.
Thank you.
So thank you so much to Auntie Lola for the beautiful welcome, and also for reminding us about the importance of NAIDOC Week. We are in the final sort of throes of NAIDOC, and it's really important this particular time of year that we're always remembering exactly what Auntie Lola ended her message with, that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We'll have an opportunity for questions towards the end of today's session. Please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to send through any questions, and I'm going to try to get to as many of them as I can. Just a reminder that when you're sending your questions through, please select all panelists and attendees when you send your questions so I can see them as well. So today we come together not only to discuss some of the important ideas and fascinating books, incredible books that we have had published over the last couple of months and years in our beautiful spaces of Aboriginal publishing today, but also to mark NAIDOC Week, time to celebrate history, culture and achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This year's NAIDOC theme, as Auntie Lola has said, is always was and always will be. And we have some incredible panellists here for you today that I hope you will all be blessed to be hearing from for, you know, what is probably one in many times. We have Julie Janson, who is a playwright, novelist and award-winning poet. She's a Burra woman of the Darug Aboriginal Nation. Her latest novel, Benevolence, from Magabala Books, was longlisted for the 2020 Mark and Yvette Moran Mib Literary Award. Also joining me today is Tony Birch, activist, historian and essayist. He's the author of several titles, including 3 novels. His work Ghost River won the 2016 Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Indigenous Writing, and Blood was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin in 2012. In 2021, Tony Birch released 2 new books, a poetry collection, Whisper Songs, and a new short story collection, Dark as Last Night. Tony's most recent work, The White Girl, from Queensland University Press, won the 2020 New South Wales Premier's Award for Indigenous Writing and was shortlisted for the 2020 Miles Franklin Literary Prize. A very warm welcome to you both. Now, I promise my fancy speech to the letter stuff is over and we're going to have a good yarn now. So opening up, I wanted to begin with you, Aunt, to talk a bit about your novel, Benevolence. You described it in an interview with Booktopia. You described it saying this historical novel is about the early years of colonisation of Australia. It is a piece of literary restorative justice and reconciliation. I'd like to kind of open up this idea of NAIDOC and this this constant emphasis that we have on terms like reconciliation and also justice, although I feel like that's a word that is pushed more coming from Aboriginal people necessarily than, say, our government or the institutions that have historically sought to kind of control and curate the lives of Aboriginal people. But I wanted to ask you to kind of tell us a little bit about Benevolence and tell us a bit about why your emphasis in this book, you know, you've written a lot of plays, you've written quite a few novels yourself. Your emphasis here is on this idea of literary restorative justice and reconciliation. And how have you come to that emphasis in your career?
Wow, it's a mouthful. Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you to Auntie Lola too for doing that Welcome to Country. Well, first of all, I'll just say a few words in Darug. Kwaibidja, Jumna, Payala, Yanui. We come together to talk in peace. My land is the Burrabarungal people of the Darug Nation on the Hawkesbury River, but I'm currently a guest here on Brinja land in Moruya, New South Wales. So thank you to the elders here, past and present, for allowing me to be here. Now, yes, the novel, Restorative Justice. Look, this novel took me a long time to write, as Tony would mostly acknowledge too. Sometimes a novel takes much longer than the actual writing phase of it. I worked for Professor Peter Reid on the website, The History of Aboriginal Sydney, for 5 years, and it was launched about 5 years ago. And while doing that research with him, and there were other Indigenous researchers also working on it, and we were required to go out and interview elders and anyone else who wanted to be interviewed, but it was mostly elders because young Aboriginal people tend to always say, no, look, I can't tell you, you've got to go and talk to aunt, or you've got to go and talk to uncle. And in the process of doing that, it was a great gift to me because I was able to uncover a lot of the stories that were really very similar to my own family stories out along the Hawkesbury River. And it uncovered a lot of detail that, you know, as a working mum, I didn't always have the time to do that kind of research. You know, we knew we were Aboriginal when we were kids. We were basically told to just shut up and get on with it, you know, just because we were living in the inner city of Sydney. And we kind of, Dad just said, don't draw attention to yourself. So, you know, we just kind of did that really. But when I did that research with Peter Reid and had the privilege of listening to those elders and filming them and getting photographs and going to the archives and finding a lot of research, this extraordinary material began to bubble out. And I thought, when this website gets launched, there's going to be someone in London sitting there and they'll say, oh, look at all this interesting information. I think I'll write a novel. And I thought, God, I've got to get in first. You know, I've done all this work on this project and the other, and Peter Reid and the other researchers as well. And I said, you know, I'm going to write a novel based on this material. And so I kind of made a starting place of wanting to kind of restore the idea of Aboriginal people not being victims, not like they're depicted in The Secret River. I think the novel The Secret River by Kate Grenfell was an inspiration for me to write a different side to that story, and I give her complete respect for opening up the conversation about that particular area on the Hawkesbury and what happened in the early days. But I felt that there was another story that needed to be told. And if we just accepted that it was a white story with a few shadowy Aboriginal people in the background, then half of the story wasn't being acknowledged, and it was it was ignoring the Aboriginal part of history. So it became very important of me to kind of restore my ancestors and other people's ancestors to the very right that they need to be centre stage in that story about Australian colonisation, and that the land was not ceded. We did defend the land and fought for the land, and above all else, we survived. And I'm a result of 4 generations of Aboriginal women who survived along the Hawkesbury River. Sometimes had children removed, lived in a terrible poverty, hand to mouth, never had a permanent address, and it's their story I was desperate to tell. So that's what was the beginning for me of writing Benevolence.
Beautiful. It's interesting actually what you say about this emphasis on characters who do survive, and we are so often historically and to the present day placed into structures of victimization regardless of what our actual participation or what our actual actions are. And the Hawkesbury, you know, that is a region particularly that is entangled in everybody else's story, constantly seeking to overwrite the actual histories of what has occurred. You know, a site of such early conquest and settlement invasion that is, you know, the site of frontier war as well, which is so constantly denied. So it's interesting that a part of your practice in there is truth telling, but how much do you think the role of imagination does have to play in, particularly in country like, you know, like the Darug Nation, which has just been subject to so much of that overwriting?
Well, and there's a way of kind of writing people out of history. If you don't acknowledge they're there, and, you know, Blaxland, Wentworth and Lawson crossed the Blue Mountains in 1813, which is what I learned at school. You know, no notion of the fact they actually travelled with, you know, a large group of Aboriginal guides who so happened to lead them over the mountain. This way of kind of annihilating any reference to Aboriginal people at all. So if you deny people exist, it's a massive piece of racism and of rewriting history, and it's a kind of a memory genocide, you know, that people, you know, you're written out of it. And the thing with something like, you know, The Secret River is that was adapted into a very good play by Andrew Bavell, and it went to London, and I think it even went to the United States, and it tells this story of the Burra people being completely massacred. Well, if that's so, who are the 7,000 people like me, who are Darug, who claim descendancy from the Burra people in that particular area on the Hawkesbury River? You know, does that mean we don't exist, or we're all a bunch of liars, or we just jumping on the bandwagon, or we're Johnny come latelys, or, you know, any other piece of kind of abuse? And it's very offensive. And I sat there watching the play twice, and I just cried at the end, wept, because I felt it was such a piece of injustice, and nothing, not to criticize those two writers. Look, I think all writers, you need to take your hat off to all of them. They all do their absolute best, and they deserve the respect for doing that. But that's what drove me to write the story. I've got to write this grandmother, great-grandma, great-great-grandma. I've got to write this story. And but, you know, I've got to make it up a lot. And recently, Grace Karskens has brought out this fantastic history book, which is called The People of the River. I don't know if you've had a look at it yet, but it absolutely goes hand in hand.
My dad.
It's a fantastic book.
Yeah.
And it tells the Aboriginal story right up against, you know, the English story. And she used all the same materials I use, but she's a really good historian. She's a professor of history, so she can do that and do all the referencing, and it's highly academic, and it's really readable. I mean, I've become a friend of hers now, which is fantastic. But, you know, I'm not that person. I was a really crappy academic, really. I just, you know, I can't, I'm just, my mind, I'm too creative. I always want to be making things and painting and drawing and making poems and putting on plays and making costumes and so a good teacher, but not a good academic. So, you know, I had to write a story and use my creative imagination and my skills as a playwright to write the dialogue. And sometimes the dialogue's kind of a bit naughty, and Mugabala was constantly saying to me, oh, you need to cut back on the dialogue. And I'm like, no, please take away anything else, but don't take away all the dialogue. Because I actually love the dialogue. It brings the characters to life. And I know Tony uses it a lot in his novels as well, that we need to hear those characters speak. And in my first draft of Benevolence, I had the wonderful Rachel Bin Salah working with me. Without her, the book wouldn't have got finished. She was so fantastic and so kind to me. And she'd say, Julie, she's sounding a bit like a victim. And I'm like, oh no, Mary can't be a victim. So, you know, I did about 5 rewrites to try and get the voice right. And that balance between using the Darug Aboriginal language, which is not a spoken language. Some of us have got some phrases, but, you know, very, very difficult to regenerate that language, but really, really important for me to have her speak in moments of the language. But you've got to be able to make the non-Darug speaking audience understand what she's saying. So it's very tricky. And, you know, other writers, other Indigenous writers have managed this maybe better than I am, but it is a challenge. Yeah.
It is. I think it's great. And I think it's also very crucial, particularly given that history of texts like The Secret River, where Darug are voiceless, that where possible, that voice is asserted and reminded. This long history of facing up to colonisation, but also this you know, much longer history of the language in the country. So I think this is you know, a great thing for people to be reading, not just in a historical sense, but also in that tradition that is now being worked on of emphasising that resistance and making clear those stories of resistance. So thank you very kindly for writing it.
I think it's interesting too when Indigenous writers, and I've noticed this in Tony's work, that there is a journey, like Tony's in The White Girl, the young girl, she travels from the country, she's on the long train journey, and you see this pathway weaving through the novel in the narrative. And I also like to do that in my books. And I tend to be a bit obsessed by rivers. I don't know, maybe I could finally write a book that didn't have a river in it, might be really handy. But the idea of kind of following the path of the serpent, the path of the eel along the river. And yeah, I mean, I loved looking at the map of the river and going on these journeys along the river, along the Hawkesbury when I was writing it. And I'd go out and stay out at Spencer, or I'd go and stay in Windsor at the old hotel there at the Macquarie Arms, just to get a sense of the flavour and the atmosphere of the times, and to make her live. But I actually lived on the Hawkesbury River when I was a young woman, a young single mother. I lived in that house, Gentleman's Holt, that I mentioned and the experiences that she has at Gentleman's Holt were pretty well kind of what happened to me when I was there. I was chased by guys in a boat who wanted to kind of rape me, and I had to grow corn and fight off the kangaroos, and all with a little tiny child, a 3-year-old child. I used to put him in the back of the canoe in an adult life jacket, don't tell the police, and I'd row down to Spencer to get supplies. But God, the risks I took, it's amazing he even survived. Anyway.
Well, now we've got the book to say, the book came out of it, and so it's balance. It's balance. You got to take the risks to get the book.
Yes.
So Tony, kind of coming to you in this same question of restorative justice, you have had a long career, not simply also of writing, but you're also an academic. You also have had a lot of involvement in different organising and different kinds of activism. And you're also a historian, so a lot of what we've just heard here about this idea of the archival, the necessity and the working through of archival stories and how they present themselves in creative writing. Can you talk a little bit about how literature, either the writing of it, the teaching of it, how your career with literature kind of configures into that broader lifetime you've had of activism of restorative justice and I wouldn't necessarily say reconciliation, because I don't think you're interested in reconciling anybody's acceptance of the violence and the ongoing injustice, but thinking about your work and thinking about how literature configures into those broader projects.
Yeah, well, I think there's always a tension for, I think, Aboriginal people who have grown up actually loving reading, and just hear Julie talking about paying respect to people like Kate Grenville, which I think is extremely generous, and I'm not suggesting it should be any different, but I know, say, a good friend of mine, Alexis Wright, she is so widely read in the canon, in the Western literary canon. And for me, there's always been a tension, because I loved reading from a kid. And there are books that I grew up with, probably famously a novel of great influence with me is a novel called Kestrel for a Knave by Barry Hines, which is about a working class kid growing up in Northern England. But I loved writing, but clearly the issue here is that I didn't want to be disrespectful to the writers or disrespectful to books, but always growing up knowing, where are the Aboriginal stories here? Where are the Aboriginal stories written and told by Aboriginal people? And of course, being largely or entirely absent, or only present as a misrepresentation. So one of the things for me, Evelyn, and I do impart this on young blackfellas, is that try to separate out our genuine disappointment, anger, criticism of what the literary canon lacks. And I think to still enjoy the ability to read widely and to respect literature, but to demand that our stories are present in that canon. So I love the way that Julie talked about her work as what I would see as an intervention in that sense. So again, to talk briefly about Secret River, it's a book that sold many, many thousands of copies. And I know Kate, by the way. I've been on writing panels with Kate. It's a book of great influence. I also saw the play and was on a panel discussing the play. And while that there is value in a book like that, clearly there is a whole story that is missing And that unless someone like Julie comes forward, unless Aboriginal writers are able to come forward and publish our interventions, that clearly students, readers of these books will never get an insight into the wider story. So for me, it's probably the easiest way to answer this is that we all, as Aboriginal people who ever have appeared on a writing panel, would have been subject to a question which goes something like this. A person puts their hand up and says, do you think non-Aboriginal people should be writing stories with Aboriginal characters in it? I've been asked that question 5,027 times. I've just calculated it here. And my answer is one that sometimes surprises people. One is that I actually say, well, it's not my position to answer that question directly. More importantly, that there will always be non-Aboriginal people writing about Aboriginal characters, whether we want to suggest that they shouldn't or not. My only interest is in ensuring that more Aboriginal people, we get to write our own story, that our books are produced, that our stories are told in theatre, through oral telling, through all media of storytelling. So then people who are interested in public culture, who are interested in literature, they might pick up a book by Kate Grenville and enjoy it, but then they can pick up Julie's book, they can pick up, Melissa Lukashenko's book, Alexis Rice's book, your poetry book that's coming out next year, and say, and this is what blackfellas have to say. And that's what matters. What matters is that we have a space to represent ourselves. And as a reader, if I want to get a great insight into any culture, of course, what I want to have access to is a range of voices. Yeah, so I grew up on cowboys and Indians stories from Hollywood, Hollywood movies. The only way I really have understood First Nations history in the US is when I read First Nations writers. So this is what we have to have. We have to be front and center in any cultural performance, any space that allows storytelling to take place. And that's what matters to me. That's what I think people need to strive for, to ensure that as many young Aboriginal writers can get a foothold in the publishing world, for instance. It's just one outcome.
I think that's really something that, as like a young writer, you feel enormously the presence of and the generosity of this generation of writers who, neither of you would have received the same opportunities that that I've been able to receive by virtue of those years of agitating, the years of working and collaborating and making those spaces and dialogues possible. Which is, it's a fantastic experience for me, like coming in as a young writer. But it also, I think, are there ever moments where it is a little bit bittersweet when you see just how much the space has changed, and how different it was for you when you were kind of coming into it, and how every sort of inch had to be fought for, every space on a page was something that was, not really given with the same enthusiasm by whether that be publishers or academic institutions or schools or spaces that, are responsible for the sort of the dispersing of that literature. That's kind of a question for both of you. Tony, we might stay with you and then we'll go to Julie for that.
Well, no, I don't feel bittersweet at all. I mean, there are a couple of issues there. Is that as much as, and I really think it's generous of you to say so, that younger writers can look to a whole generation of older Aboriginal people who are publishing, and it's the publishing world, for all its limitations, is very rich with Aboriginal writers at present. So we have 4 current Miles Franklin Award winners. We have when you go to festivals and events, when I started going to festivals, 15 years ago, probably, there would be lucky to be another Aboriginal person there. You would never be interviewed by an Aboriginal person. Rarely would there be an Aboriginal person in the audience. And so if you were raising issues of concern that, created tension, you're a target. So you'd go to talk about the value of books and you end up in a huge bun fight, or punch on. So you'd have to take on all these white fellas who just, sort of chasing around the stage trying to kill you. So when I go to festivals now, there are always, it's like a circus troupe, like a blackfella circus troupe. So if I go to a festival, there's always a heap of other young and old Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people there, and you meet up with each other, you go to each other's events, you back each other up, and you just feel, well, you feel safer for one, and you, strangely, you don't feel like and you might be surprised to learn I was occasionally an angry young man. You don't have to be angry. Like, you don't have to be angry, because you don't go in there thinking this is a gunfight and I've got to get on the front foot. You actually go there thinking, no, I remember in Adelaide I can see Natalie Harkin in the front row. I can see all her mates from South Australia, and they've got my back, so I could relax a lot more and then enjoy the session a lot more. So the first thing to say is no, I don't, because I feel really indebted to people for supporting me. But as you said about younger people coming in, there are new pressures on younger people than we face. So I think the pressures are just different. I don't think younger people have it easier. I think there are different challenges. But in the sense of saying, well, who came before? There is always someone who came before. So that in my case, as you know, I've done a lot of historical work. So I worked as a historian in my younger days and taught history at the University of Melbourne. A lot of my academic research was looking at archival material, looking at Aboriginal women's writing from missions and reserves, primarily in Victoria. And it's not hard to think, all I've got to do is, I live in Carlton. I've got, a good job. I can sit at my desk and type around a computer. No one's going to come banging on my door and ask, what am I doing, and take my computer off me? Not at this stage anyway. These women who were writing these letters to have their kids taken home, to get better food, to get a more, a roof repaired, they were writing at a kitchen table, sometimes on a brown paper envelope that had been used for yesterday's school lunch, with a pencil. And then they had to find a stamp to go and send that letter of demand off to the Chief Secretary of the Parliament in Melbourne. And then when that letter of protest, demand for Aboriginal rights, was received, that could be something passed on to a local copper who could come and knock on that woman's door and say, you stop agitating or we'll take your children. You stop agitating or you won't get any ration. Mm-hmm. So these women were writing under extreme duress. So not only do I have the benefit of their struggle, so that led to other women getting, struggling for kids to get into school, et cetera, et cetera. What I have to deal with, in the sense of going to a festival and having to maybe get into a blue with some right-wing nutcase, that's nothing. That's nothing. That's not a fight. So I've got to remember, these women bled for us, literally. They gave up their lives for us. And what we have to do is not only pay respect to it, to say that gift is something that allows me enormous freedom. So I'm not someone who feels constrained. I'm someone who feels in relative sense, I feel I've been gifted great freedoms because of what those women went through. And of course, I do hope that younger generations realize that as well, but not have to say, oh, you had it so hard. To me, I haven't had it hard at all in a relative sense. I would say I've had it easy. I feel very lucky.
And I think about, as you were talking about that, I was just thinking about Odette and that character and that voice in The White Girl as well.
These women, with Odette, I did this on purpose. They pay with their bodies pay. So the physicality of having to look after children, it's something that impacts on women psychologically and emotionally, but it's a physical attack on their bodies. And we know that Odette is very sick because she is privileging the protection of her granddaughter at the cost of her physical health. And I know this through my mum's generation. All these women, they're now in their 80s, and I'm not saying this in any critical way. My mum would love me to say this. These women have really hard heads because they gave up everything to protect their children, and you see it on their bodies. Their bodies carry the scars of a life of struggle, whether it be physically, mental scars, and they're just rocks. These women, they're just rocks.
No, absolutely. Julie, I want to ask you that same question about how you feel about the changing landscape of literature and publishing right now. But also, I think Tony's brought up some really powerful things about women and about that the the sheer, like the blood, sweat, the tears that goes into these acts of remembering that we are now able to access these archives as a kind of a relic of that daily struggle for their place on their country, for their children. And of course, we have these long archival histories of Aboriginal women begging for the return of their children. And I'd be interested in hearing what some of your thoughts are about that, with the way that you constructed and wrote the character of Mary in Benevolence. So that's two questions that I want to throw to you.
The second one first, and then I'll have to be reminded what the first one was. But,
sounds good.
In Benevolence, I came up with the title Benevolence as an ironic title. And originally, when I began to write the novel, I was going to write a little bit about the Benevolence Society, because in the research that I did, and this is very much on Tony's point, I found in the archives some documents from the Benevolence Society in Windsor in 1866, where 3 children who were the siblings of my great-grandmother, who I knew as a child in Chatswood, had been taken away by the Benevolence Society. And there was the document, and there were their names. It was Fanny, William, I've forgotten the other one, and little children from 3, 7, 8. And it said, mother unable to care for them, father in the lunatic asylum. And I looked at that scratchy writing in ink on that Benevolence Society document, and I thought, well, you know, what is this information telling me? Because I realized that it was the year that the mother of these children, my great-great-grandmother, married a convict. And she was already in her 30s, already had 4 children. She kept the oldest child because he was 11 and he could work log splitting with the convict, you know, stepfather along the river in the estates along the Hawkesbury River. And he was dead within a year from typhoid, because they set up a tanning factory on the Mother River, Wayanamata, and poisoned the water of South Creek, and poisoned all the people who lived along it with typhoid, and he was dead. But the fact that, you know, that great-great-grandmother had given these children up in order to marry this convict, and I can imagine the conversation with this man was something along the lines of, he was 20 years older than her. I'll marry you and protect you if you give away those little black children, keep the old one to work with me, and we'll start a new family, which she did. She went on to have another 4 children, including my great-grandma, who I knew as a little girl. So everything that Tony has said, you know, I can back up from reading my own family's experience, and the difficulty of raising children. Look, if it wasn't for Aboriginal women along that river, you know, I mean, I think the men got such a hard time, Aboriginal men. I mean, they were the warriors, they were the producers of food, they were the hunters, they were the ones most oppressed, the ones most killed, ones most murdered. Very difficult for both Aboriginal men and women. What was the first question?
The first question was about, yeah, I know you connected it really beautifully, Tony. So it's a bit of a piecing together thing. The first question was about kind of these changing landscapes.
Yeah, well, I agree with Tony too, that it is actually a very exciting and vibrant time to be a writer today. I mean, I first started writing plays when I was living in Arnhem Land in the 1970s, and had an amazing time doing that, you know, just taking plays to very traditional communities who had ceremony going on all the time, but then there were these kind of Western style plays. And one day I, with the students I was with at Elko Island, we made a whole lot of costumes, which were skeleton costumes and batik, you know, and big masks. And the end of their play, it was their play they'd written with me. They ran onto the stage as skeletons, and the audience of 400 Yolngu people got up screaming and ran away and didn't come back. And I went, wow, the power of theatre, you know, just like, anyway, so, you know, I was, as a playwright, it's kind of, being a playwright's kind of a bit more sexy than being a novelist. And I found I mixed with extraordinary people like Justine Saunders and Lillian Crombie and Kevin Smith, and you know, had an amazing time putting on plays with those actors, all of whom contributed in their own wonderful way to the dialogue and the action of the plays. They would never have been the plays they were if it wasn't for those people. So we all stand on the back of the people who went before us, just as Tony said. We stand on the back of those wonderful Indigenous writers and actors and directors who've gone before us. Yeah.
That's beautiful as well to think about too, this kind of, particularly when both of you are working in archival histories in your work. And Tony, I feel like that's probably been a feature of like most of your writing, that there is some kind of constant sort of consciousness or engagement with the archival, but it's beautiful to also think about, you know, it's not simply in weaving these sorts of ideas of historicity in the archive, but also these like still living and still with us histories of who's made the fields that we're now all kind of able to work in. And it's interesting because we did get a question sent in to us before this, before the panel started, of is there anything you wish to have made available for First Nations writers that is missing or has a success in recent years from things like awards, prizes and programs assisted? So I'd kind of like to ask both of you that question of like, what more, you know, what intervention, what disruption, what, you know, what work still needs to be done? Because I do feel like there is still more work that needs to be done, not simply in the space of publishing, but also of the broader context of our storytelling and our voices. You know, what work do you feel needs to happen in this space?
Well, to be quite frank, I think there are two things. One is that no young Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander kid who wants to work on storytelling in any form should ever think that they can't do it. And I'm not saying, you know, just do it. I'm not suggesting, you know, I hate those narratives which say if you really apply yourself, you will be able to do it. Well, that's not true, because there are all sorts of barriers put in place in front of Aboriginal people. And I think it's just as problematic to say to a kid, you can do it if you really believe. I would say to a kid, if you really believe, I hope that will keep you working. But an Aboriginal kid who can't get proper access to school or education, or has, you know, might be living in a house where you can't even get your toilet fixed. I mean, it's impossible to say to that kid, yeah, you can just do it, because you can't. There are two things. I think that when a young Aboriginal person thinks about making work, whether it be theatre, writing, any other form of the arts, that their second thought is, I want to do that. So in other words, the enthusiasm and energy needs to be supported. So it's nothing worse than a person thinking, but I can't do that. So we need to change that mindset. And I think by looking at mentors and role models and people who have gone before, I think that matters a lot, because you can actually say, well, this person has achieved in this way. But you need institutional support, you need financial support, you need structural support. So that I think that when, you know, I worked at the University of Melbourne for many years, when you think of the support available to students in that very rich university, I mean, it doesn't make you become a great writer, because your talent is much more than giving resources. But the fact is, for those who want to pursue the idea of writing, for instance, the support they had was enormous. And I would know that for many young Aboriginal people, you will never get to know how good a person could be if they don't have that support. So we need really important structures of support that are controlled by Aboriginal people, but are properly financed, properly rewarded. And yeah, I would love nothing more to think about the notion of young people getting access to not only our leadership, for want of a better term, but places and spaces where they can pursue what it is that they're dreaming about. And I have never, like, I remember a few years ago, I did a writing workshop with all the Koori kids at the Albury High School for the Writers Along the Murray Festival, or Writers Around the Murray, or Around the River, Along the River. And it was that classic thing where I walked out thinking, these kids are just dynamic. Yeah, you just think, you spend 2 hours with these young blackfellas and you fall in love with them. You know, they're just beautiful kids and you want to do stuff with them. But you know, the fact, once they walk out of that workshop, their ability to continue that process, they have so many barriers in front of them. and they might never get to enjoy that again. So for me, is that we've got to make sure we pursue, both through government and through philanthropic organisations, the places, programs that will give these kids a chance to take their ideas further. Because I know when I'm teaching these kids, if we give them the support that they need, that they will come through, and they will tell new stories that I don't tell, stories that I can't tell, that you can't tell, that Julie can't tell. So there's a whole generation of young people out there with new stories to tell, and we need to find ways to allow them to tell those stories.
I agree with Tony very much on that. I've worked for quite a long period of time with Macquarie University, Wallangamaroo, as an elder really, and have taken part many years over many years in helping to raise funds for student scholarships, etc. But it requires a huge amount of work to get together all those artworks, and it's a bit like, oh, okay, you know, the Coreys can go out and run a cake store in order to get a scholarship for these students. Well, you know, when is that kind of attitude going to end? I mean, I take my hat off to Macquarie University for what it's done, but I just think when millions and millions and millions of dollars in universities is kind of tipped down the hole of you know, useless PhDs or dreadful buildings, and you can't even get enough scholarships to keep Aboriginal students at school and Torres Strait Island students at university. And traineeships with businesses. I often give a welcome to businesses in the Wright area for Darug people. And I always make the point of saying, you know, words are easy. It's very easy in NAIDOC week to come out and, you know, get an elder to come and get a guy and a didgeridoo to come and someone to dance and say, oh, we've got a reconciliation action plan. It usually is not worth the paper it's written on. Because I said, well, what traineeships are you doing? Oh, no, we don't think Aboriginal people would really like this business. That's give them a chance. For Christ's sake, start supporting them when they're at university. When I was at university, first year university, I lived on bloody wheat bix. That's what I lived on. I couldn't even afford a cup of coffee. And, you know, that's just the way it was. I didn't think it was anything particularly different about me, but I would go and sit out on the lawn and cry when all the other students went and had their coffees, you know. And I just think, you know, people have got to put their money where their mouth is and actually assist Aboriginal people to get a decent education. And I know a lot of people have done very well, and we've got a very flourishing middle class for Indigenous people. But there's a hell of a lot of people that I see here in places like Moruya who live with the arse out of their pants. You know, there's so much poverty. And we've just got such a long way to go before it's an equal playing field. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's I think, you know, both of you, I would say, you know, can speak to that academic context of, on the one hand, this fostering of Indigenous excellence, often for the benefit of the magazines and the newsletters, but does that ever actually go hand in hand with things like dignity and things like this actual agency being given to you know, people working in universities, blackfellas working in universities, to the students to actually provide what is needed as opposed to what looks good for, you know, the reconciliation outcome plan, reconciliation action plan outcomes. So it's good to keep, I think, talking about that and emphasising and agitating for that with whatever tools we have available, whether that be writing, whether that be activism, protest, anything we have access to. I want to let the audience know that we are accepting any questions, any comments that you would like to send in and I can hand them over to our presenters. So far we have had one lovely comment saying hello to your dog, Tony. So there's some positivity we've got so far there. I do still have some of these questions that were sent in before, so I might, we've had two people write in quite curious as to how your work has been received by different audiences, particularly about by, you know, audiences overseas, but also how are they engaged with by, you know, Black, Indigenous writers of colour and educators. So, you know, Tony, do you want to start with that, and then we'll go to Julie with that question?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, as far as overseas readers go, I have a little mini fan club in Kyoto in Japan. So the only other place in the world that I know that my books are read, and Germany actually, but in Kyoto, I've spoken at universities there, and I know that they're currently doing the White Girl at university. And one of the things that I love about the Japanese readership of students is that they don't get caught up in any sort of essentialist notions of what an Aboriginal person should be. So they don't have those sort of questions, but how do you fit into that? Or, you know, this girl, Sissy, she doesn't seem like the Aboriginal person or the Aborigine that we should understand. What they're really interested in is old-fashioned ideas of, you know, social justice and inequality. So that what I've really enjoyed about my dialogue with those students is that they understand what they see as people being literally marginalized from society, people who have had their own culture stolen from them, and they take that very seriously, and they've written about my work, I think, in really sophisticated ways. So I've really enjoyed that. In Australia, I think with this book in particular, I wasn't anxious, but I took a very, I felt a great deal of responsibility with this book in relationship to the fact that my two central characters were women. Now, I've written female characters before, but writing an Aboriginal matriarch, I didn't feel that, by the way, that I couldn't do it, but I really felt very conscious about doing it as best I could, I suppose is the best way to put it. The reception of the book from Aboriginal older women has been remarkably supportive. And I think that the comments that have been made to me, not only by Aboriginal women, by Aboriginal people in general, have been really rewarding. I think just off the top of my head, Daniel Browning, who people will know from the Away program on ABC, and Daniel's been a great support of my work for many years. He said, "I can't believe that this is not about my nan." How did you find out about my nan? I mean, it was just so sweet of Daniel, but the fact that Aboriginal people can recognise a sense, you know, something of their own family was invaluable. And the non-Aboriginal readership, which of course is most of your readers, you know, just by numbers, the book's being taught here in schools. It's sold more than any of my other books, so it's doing well commercially. Again, the responses I've had in book clubs, festivals, talking to people, again, has been really generous, really thought-provoking, so that the readers have felt really challenged about the ideas of caste legislation, the exemption acts, and they've really thought a lot more about the imposition on our lives through legislation rather than simply direct frontier violence. So it's not, I didn't set out to write a history book or a didactic story, but I think I've really enjoyed the way that it's been thought-provoking. I've only had publicly 2 quite negative responses to the book, and they were, well, one was very negative, and coincidentally, they did come from 2 middle-class white men, middle-aged. And what struck me about it is that it sounds odd because you can't, as a writer, you can't simply cherry pick criticism and say, oh, that person doesn't know, that person does. You've got to take criticism as it comes. And if people don't like your work, so be it. You've got to cop that. What I was surprised about is they could just not associate with Odette Brown at all. And I found that a little worrying because to me, it showed some sort of emotional disconnect. And rather than feel offended, I actually did feel that one of those men had that emotional literacy to engage with the feelings of a woman like Odette. So I was more curious about it than I was annoyed. So generally, to answer your question, I feel very lucky. I've published quite a few books, and I feel that my readers are very generous towards my work, and I have a very, I suppose, loyal readers. So I have people who read all my stuff. So I feel very fortunate to be in the position I'm in as a writer.
Thank you. Julie, what are your sort of thoughts on response and readership?
Well, most of my writing background up to this point, up to the last 2 years, has been as a playwright and more recently as a poet. I've really only taken on novels in the last 6 years or something. But I remember one day I was selling I make these bungalow baskets with emu feathers, and I was selling them at the black markets in down near Barangaroo in Sydney. And some young Noongar girls from Perth came up and were looking at the baskets, and they didn't have much money. And so, I gave one basket away and we're having a chat. And they said, "Oh, you're Julie Janson. It's great to meet you." And I said, "Yeah, okay, I am." And they picked up my book of the Crocodile Hotel, and they said, "We do your play every year at Whopper." And I went, "What?" I was like, "Really?" Because, my play Gungies was on in, 1993 or something, and kind of disappeared completely. It was published by Aboriginal Studies Press along with Black Mary, but I had no idea that anyone had even performed it. And they said, "Oh, no, it's part of the Indigenous studies at Whopper, and we do it every single year. We love it." And they started quoting bits from the play, and I was just so thrilled. I mean, that meant much more to me than a review. I got some really crappy reviews from Gungies, even though we had the most amazing actors, Lillian Crombie and Kevin Smith. And so that was fantastic. And then another play, which is performed nearly every year in Ujang Pandang in Makassar, Sulawesi, because it tells the story of the trading partnership between the Macassan traders from Sulawesi going to northeast Arnhem Land and trading with Yolngu people. And of course, I heard these stories when I was living with Yolngu people in the Northern Territory. So I eventually wrote this play called The Eyes of Morigi, which was on at the Sydney Opera House in the studio, and it went to the Adelaide Asia Festival, the inaugural one. And I thought, that's the end of it. It's been on. We did this wonderful kind of bringing all these actors over from Indonesia, and we had traditional actors from northeast Arnhem Land. And I thought that was the end of it. But no, they perform it every single year in Makassar. And when last year they did it with a cast of 200 people. I was just like, sometimes it's just fantastic to be a writer and realize that you've reached out much further than your cozy little, did I get my book published, and, did I sell 1,500 copies? So, yeah, it's a great privilege. Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. I think we've got time for one more question. So I might ask a short one that we received earlier. It's asking about do you have suggestions for educators and activists in amplifying literature by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander books? And then the follow-up was, what particular books or other literature would you recommend? So maybe just the briefer end of that would be, what do you think people should be reading at the moment? And particularly, what do you think should be kind of elevated and amplified by educational institutions at the moment? Julie, we might stay with you for that one and then go to Tony.
Well, you can't go past reading Kim Scott's Let Dead Man Dance for an amazing way of how he managed to weave Noongar language into an English, English language to understand that extraordinary story from West Australia. Alexis Wright, really the doyen of Indigenous writers, as far as I'm concerned, magnificent, world-class writing. It's like reading any of the greats. I think you start with, Melissa Lukashenko, Too Much Slip, Tony Birch as the white girl,
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the poets, the Evelyn Araluens, just go through them all, Anita Heiss, just have the privilege. And don't forget people like Jack Davies, the extraordinary plays that came out of West Australia and Perth in the 1990s and took Sydney by storm. They were so extraordinary. And the wonderful Ernie Dingo playing the lead role in quite a few of them. Yeah, I think you just start with the Indigenous writers and enjoy yourself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Tony, what do you reckon?
Well, just on both questions, firstly, for educators and activists, is that we know that our work is well taught and well enjoyed, but it's not taught sometimes at senior level. Certainly year 12 in Victoria is lacking badly. You need to agitate at your school, you know, as parents, as teachers, to ensure that these books are given space. And you need to make those demands, because that's important work that you can do. Just to say that. Probably for books is that I go to another Kim Scott book, which is way back a bit now, Benang. I think Benang is a remarkable Kim Scott novel, as are all his books, but for a really great insight and a sort of critique and interrogation of the whole notion of stolen generations history, I think it's remarkable. I also love Alexis Wright's book Tracker, because Tracker is a very different book that Alexis did. There's a multiplicity of Aboriginal voices in that book. It's a great book if you want to understand the Aboriginal political work that people do on the ground and what it requires, and the negotiation it requires, the pragmatism it requires, the tenacity it requires. That is a great book of giving you a sort of a collage of all those voices. And I would just reiterate what Julie said. I think you've got to start to read a lot more younger people. And I think younger people, probably the most dynamic area of our production at the moment is in poetry. So I would read the host of this session this afternoon, whose collection Drop Bear is coming out in the first half of 2021. If she doesn't get me to do an event with her, I'll be very disappointed.
You're going to be sick of events with me.
Alan van Nerven, who's of course a short story writer, but also is a great, great poet. But if I had to really call out for one person, not that I would, but Natalie Harkin in South Australia. I think she's doing remarkable work at the moment in the area that, of course, that we've talked about today, that I love. Her ability to interrogate the archive and get it to speak in a way that it doesn't wish to is not only great poetic work, but it's great political work. And just to finish that, what Natalie is doing is you look at an archival document and it wants to say one thing, and it wants to say that in a very limited way and to silence Aboriginal voices. What Natalie Harkin's work is doing is demanding that the Aboriginal voice in that document is heard. So I think what she's doing is really special, but just don't read old people like me all the time. Start to read people, I don't know, under 40, I would put us by Yasik. That young generation are very energetic. They have a lot to say, and they're not going to sit back for much longer. They're going to push people like me out of the way, go and sit in the corner, uncle. It's my time to take over. And if you don't do that, I'll be very disappointed.
Here. I agree.
I love these good-natured threats. They're lovely.
I will make one last comment. I think there is room for another Indigenous publishing house. Yeah. Wagabala's been going for 25 years and they're absolutely brilliant, but they can't do it all alone. You know, I think we need another Indigenous publishing house, and I don't know how that's going to happen, but I think we're crying out for it, you know.
And also Black publishers, Aboriginal publishers, Torres Strait Islander publishers. I think that's something we would really like. I'd love to see more editors and stuff in that space as well, if I can throw my 2 cents in. You know, so Rachel Binsala and Grace Lucas Pennington, great Black editors that we should be celebrating as well. Okay, so that's time. We do encourage you to continue the conversation or to share any highlights from today's session on your social media. There are some hashtags you can use, hashtag NibLit2020, careful with the way you spell these ones, hashtag Waverley Council and hashtag NAIDOC 2020. Tony Birch and Julie Janson, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. Please buy their books if you haven't already. Benevolence and the White Girl are the most current publications, but there are, you've both got websites, you can both find out about other publications from these writers. I would encourage you to, purchase books if you can as Christmas presents, and try to, as much as possible, buy from Australian independent publishers. It's been a really rough year for booksellers, so just as much as you possibly can, try to buy local, buy as gifts. Just try to, support the industry as much as you can right now. All NIB Award featured books can be purchased through NIB Award community partner Gertrude and Alice Bookstore Cafe, online as well at gertrudeandalice.com. A big thank you to Auntie Lola Ryan for introducing this event and for giving us a welcome to country, and a thank you from myself and also the Waverley Council. Thank you to our audience, people who sent in questions. Thank you to Dog in the corner. Love to have an audience there that's live and moving and listening. Thank you all for this wonderful conversation. And I hope everybody has a beautiful day and a beautiful rest of NAIDOC.
Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, Tony. And thank you to Waverley Council very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely weekend. Bye.